Good evening, everyone, and welcome to America at a Crossroads. We're truly grateful that you've chosen to spend part of your evening with us for what promises to be a thoughtful and illuminating conversation. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, and me. That's our leadership team. Tonight, we are especially honored to welcome back one of the most respected and essential voices in American political journalism, and that's Ron Brownstein. Few observers of our democracy bring Ron's depth of understanding of elections, institutions, demographic change, and deeper currents shaping our national life. His work helps all of us see more clearly not only what is happening, but what it means. We are very fortunate to have him with us this evening, and we are equally fortunate to be joined by our moderator tonight, the incomparable Patt Morrison. Pat's distinguished career spanning radio, television, and print has earned the highest honors in journalism, including Emmy Awards, Golden Mikes, and a Pulitzer. For so many Angelenos and far beyond, her voice has long been one of clarity, intelligence, and civic seriousness. We are deeply grateful that she is such a valued part of America at a Crossroads. Just briefly, a look ahead. Next week, we will welcome Carol Leonig, the five-time Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, for a conversation about her important new book, Injustice: How Politics and Fear Vanquished America's Justice System. At a moment when the rule of law and democratic accountability feel increasingly fragile, her work could not be more urgent. The week after, we will welcome Susan Glasser, and so we have a really wonderful lineup. You can sign up for all of these programs in the email that you will receive following tonight's program. As always, we will continue to bring you voices of distinction addressing the most consequential issues of our time, and we're grateful for the community that makes these conversations possible. Without our amazing audience, none of this would happen. And now it is my great pleasure to turn the program over to Patt Morrison, who will begin our conversation with Ron Brownstein. Pat, over to you.
Thank you, Janice, and thanks to all of you who watch so regularly and support these programs here at a vital time in our nation's history. We also want to remind you, if you have questions for Ron Brownstein, and I'm sure you will, I know you all very well by now, you can put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many as we can later on in the program. So your questions for Ron Brownstein, be sure to listen. He might have an answer for your question before we get to that moment. And Ron, of course, joining us again, always happy to have him, the senior political analyst for CNN and a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. Ron, my old colleague, it's nice to see you again.
It's good to be with you again, Pat. Can we start by, I think we have to express our sincere condolences to everyone who is not in LA today for this incredible 80-degree day while everyone is shivering. So our deepest apologies for that everyone can't be with us in person.
Yes, today we started the sunscreen season, so sorry everybody about that.
Yeah.
So Ron, we're talking in the broader sense about the 2026 midterms that are coming up or maybe not coming up, and we're going to be getting in depth with that. But the two biggest headlines, I think, of the past week have been the one where Kash Patel's FBI took the 2020 ballots away from the custody and care of the state of Georgia, the state elections board, and that Donald Trump has been talking about nationalizing the elections. As we know, even in presidential years, there is not one election. There are thousands of elections run by thousands of local governments, local, city, state, county, across the nation. And nationalizing them is not only something that the Constitution sets out and says, no, you're not going to do that, but it also becomes an instrument of power in everybody's mind. So if you want to deal with these separately and then where they converge, I think everyone would like to hear that.
Sure. This is a year where we have to do something I don't think we've ever had to do. We have to kind of discuss what might unfold in this election, if it is a conventional, traditional election, and we can talk about the dynamics that are appearing in public opinion and in the candidates, and what kind of trajectory we're on for November. And I'm sure we will do that as we go on. But then there is door number two, which is that we might not see a traditional free and fair election. And I think there are clearly warning signals. One thing I believe has become very clear over the past year is that in Donald Trump's second term, there are no idle musings. People sometimes say, well, he's just kind of talking out loud and making things, and just kind of brush it off. He doesn't succeed in doing everything he talks about. Sometimes he is stopped. But I believe that everything he talks about, he tries to do. I mean, look at Greenland, right? I mean,
Or
people,
exactly, Greenland, or he's signaling something at least, knowing he can't accomplish it, but sending a message to the people who are
yeah.
listening to him, who may be trying in their own way to do as much as they can to achieve.
Exactly right. And so, people who look at the Georgia raid and say, well, Trump is just scratching his obsession over 2020 and he can't let it go. I think that's completely the wrong way to look at it. I think this is not something about looking back. This is something about looking forward. I mean, he is testing the water in effect to see what the reaction is going to be in the public and the Congress and the courts to this kind of really unprecedented and indefensible overreach of federal power into state, literally seizing ballots. We both covered politics for a long time. I do not think there is a precedent for that, at least not one that I know of. And I think he is clearly raising the possibility of something like this happening again in November, in particularly in Democratic strongholds. You could imagine not only ICE trying to disrupt polling places in Democratic areas, but also what, if anything, he is willing to try to do to subvert the counting of the ballots. The federal government has, the president, first of all, has no role. I mean, the Constitution leaves elections to the states, except that it allows the Congress to set the rules for congressional elections. But I don't think that he's envisioning passing legislation. I mean, they're not, they could pass something out of the House that could be very restrictive. They're not going to get 60 votes in the Senate, and they may not even get 50 votes in the Senate to really mess with election administration. I think what we are seeing here instead is a clear signal, again, that as on every other front that we have watched over the past 14 months, he is envisioning unilateral exercise of presidential power in a way that we've never seen before, and that threatens basic assumptions about our democracy. And so I would encourage everyone to be on full alarm and alert, and talking to your elected officials, both at the state and the national level, about what they are prepared to do to defend this election, because unfortunately, I think they're probably going to have to before it's over.
It seems like the states are getting their act together in a sense of unifying or cohering their response. In Georgia, you've seen people go to court to
Mhm.
challenge the seizure of the ballots. You saw the agenda out in the open in Minnesota, where I think it was Pam Bondi who said, if you give us your voter rolls, we
Yeah.
will take the ICE agents away. It couldn't be clearer. It couldn't be more blatant. And other states like California have said hell no to some of those
Right,
efforts.
and they're suing. They're suing. The administration is suing some of the states trying to get access to the voter rolls. I mean, there is not one threat to the election. I mean, this is like the post 2020 period. It's going to be a multi-front struggle, trying to get access to voter rolls and disqualify voters, potentially disrupting polling places, using potentially trying to pressure the post office in ways to affect mail balloting. The Supreme Court may between now and, well, they will between now and November, now and next June. No, I guess it could go past the no, next June. It'd be before the midterm. Rule on whether states can count ballots received after Election Day. So there's a lot of different fronts that are going to be in play here. Now, if the election is held under normal circumstances or something approaching normal circumstances, there are a lot of signs that there are serious headwinds developing for Republicans, and potentially a tough election night. But it is not at all. We don't know what the election is going to look like. One other thing I would say, though, Pat, which is that I think there is a mistaken assumption, mostly on the part of the president and his supporters, that this is really a one-way street, that they have what military planners call escalation dominance in this, that basically they can decide how far to push this, and no one really else has any kind of say in what happens. I think that is totally wrong. I do not think that if they move in serious ways to subvert the election, that blue America states and cities and voters will simply say, well played, you got us. look at you found a way, and end run around American democracy. No, I think that if they subvert the election, that they are opening the door to a level of civil unrest that is really unprecedented in modern American history, and that I think could be comparable only to what we saw in the fall of the Eastern Bloc countries in the late 1980s. I mean, if they overtly steal the election, if they overtly seize ballots and stop ballots from being counted in Phoenix
or cast
or Atlanta or cast, I think you would. I think they would be letting loose forces that they cannot control, and I think you would see millions of people in the street who would recognize that for whatever kind of trajectory we are on, this is an on-off switch moment when the country is transitioning from one sort of institution, a democracy, into something less than that.
You see it at virtually every level, from the constitutional challenge when he says we need to nationalize elections, down to the granular where you got someone like Steve Bannon saying, well, sure, we're going to put ICE in front of polling places.
Yeah.
You and I both remember in 1988 in Orange County, California, the Republican Party sent uniformed private security guards to stand outside Latino populated voting areas, polling places, and say, well, are you really a citizen? And scaring away the vote. And they got rebuked for it. They got disciplined. They got fined for it. But now we see it at a national level. And who's going to stop him? Which seems to be Trump's motto. Oh, yeah, you and whose army?
Right. Look, I mean, I am sure, certainly secretaries of state, particularly in blue, I think maybe only entirely in blue states, are developing legal strategies. And I don't know the extent to which governors are developing physical strategies. I mean, this question that has been coming, I feel, is heading toward us inevitably, is clashes between federal forces and state and local forces in blue jurisdictions. I mean, we have not yet seen the Minnesota police trying to defend someone against ICE, but I could imagine that we're going to be heading there sooner or later. I mean, Trump certainly seems to be barreling down that kind of track, and the election day might be a day where I don't know what Democratic governors are thinking yet about how, or Democratic mayors about how they're going to defend the sanctity of the ability of people to vote if there are physical threats to it against it from the federal government. I mean, look at these sentences we're exchanging back. Look at what we're talking about. We've both been covering politics for a long time. And I don't think anybody in our lifetime or in a previous since really since the era of Jim Crow, I mean, would have been asking questions like this. And of course, then it was the states suppressing the vote and the federal government trying to support it. And now you have the opposite potentially.
And this is one of those wild cards on the table. It's maybe not so wild anymore. The odds that Trump will use even the protests we're seeing to justify the Insurrection Act and give him a free hand, essentially unshackle him to the extent that he's not already unshackled.
I think there's a reason they haven't done it yet. I mean, there's a reason they tried this elaborate alternative under laws passed in the early 1900s to try to federalize state national guards without using the Insurrection Act. And which is what the rare occasion where the Supreme Court has said, no, you can't do that. I think they recognize that using the Insurrection Act, and I'm not saying it's beyond him, and I certainly think it's something that is possible, but I think they recognize that that would be a five-alarm fire for much of the country. And if you look at the intense backlash they have gotten in polling pretty clearly over what they're doing in Minneapolis, I think invoking the Insurrection Act and sending the 82nd Airborne into Minnesota or Seattle or San Jose or Boston or Springfield or wherever they want to go next. I think they recognize again that they risk significant backlash. The people, I have spent more time in the Trump era with political scientists who study democracy worldwide than I ever did before. And because, we are now in the situation of many countries around the world who have faced the reality or the risk of democratic backsliding, of democratic institutions being eroded and tugged towards something more like authoritarianism. And one of the things the people who study that will tell you is that using force against your own people is almost or is always counterproductive unless you are willing to go all the way to massive force against your own people. Like, if you use like what we're seeing in Minneapolis, I wrote in mid-January that the tolerance among the public and even Republican members of Congress for killing middle-aged, middle-class white people in service of mass deportation is probably a lot lower than Stephen Miller would predict or prefer. And I think that has been borne out. I think Insurrection Act would be that on steroids. And once you go down that road, the people who study this will say that once you go down that road, you are making your situation worse unless you are simply going to completely overthrow the democracy with massive bloodshed.
Yeah.
And, I don't know about Stephen Miller, but I'm not sure whether Trump is willing to go that far, and certainly whether enough institutions in society are willing to let him. So I think they have to be careful about how much they escalate the violence. I mean, if they continue this kind of ICE approach to mass street presence in cities where they are going specifically to be hostile, and I think you and I have both felt going back to LA, this was designed to provoke public pushback, which would then become the justification for more escalation. But what they discovered is when they get into that cycle, again, they do not have escalation dominance like they thought. I mean, the public had agency too. People, what did Springsteen say with your whistles and your phones? People with their whistles and phones have a response, and that triggered something that is pretty clearly beyond where the vast majority of Americans are willing to go. So how much room do they have to shoot another protester? Like, I feel like the Alex Predator reaction was not double the Renee Good reaction. It was, 100 times bigger. So what is the next one going to be? So I think there are limits.
One of them looks less and less like one person going rogue, but an informed and practiced policy of permitting violence.
Yeah. Look, I think, again, if you are willing to go all the way into full-scale Tiananmen style repression, you can do this. But if you go part ways and there is still any kind of democratic process, the evidence from around the world is that you lose support and you weaken your position rather than strengthening it.
Before we get to the actual sense of the campaign, such as it will be waged for 2026, I do want to point out that the protests against Vietnam, even though the larger disproportionate numbers of Black and brown men were being killed and drafted, it took a big turnout by middle-class white people to turn a lot of the attitude around about Vietnam. And you wonder that there may be that demographic tipping point going on now, apropos of ICE. And
well, I would go even further. And not only is it middle class, white, even a substantial, and we'll come back to this in a minute, even a substantial portion of the absolute bedrock of Trump's base, which are white adults without a 4-year college degree, non-college whites, working class whites, blue collar whites, all of the different synonyms that we use, you're seeing half or more of them saying that ICE is going too far and the shootings are unjustified. And that is just an earthquake, because those are pretty culturally conservative voters who certainly are on board with the broader idea of pretty significant deportation. But the scenes that we are seeing in the streets in Minneapolis simply are not sustainable in a democracy. Again, like, if you go down this road, you can't go 2 steps down it. You got to keep going, or else it's net weakening your position.
What you wrote about the midterms is that, so often midterms are rejecting something about an incumbent president, but it seems to be that on steroids, because the Democrats are not loved.
Yeah.
And, even among themselves are divided about how to approach this. I mean, Trump is a gift to them if you can strategize correctly. Trump's hated policies are a gift to them, and yet getting those constituencies together and making it, again, an effort that is not just about Trump, but giving something positive for people to vote for, not just against Trump, has always been a problem for Democrats.
Yeah, and obviously they still have serious image problems. But I believe the evidence is incontrovertible that the single most important factor in off-year elections are views of the incumbent president, far more than views of the party out of the White House. And I'll kind of go through this in a minute. What we have seen, what we're basically living through is a transformation of our elections into something more like what you see in a parliamentary system, where it is less about individuals and more about which party you want to see in control of the national agenda. And that question, which party you want to see in control of the national agenda, is overwhelmingly centered, pivoting on your view about the incumbent president. As I like to say, we are in an era where the color on the front of the jersey matters more than the name on the back of the jersey. Or do you want to see kind of the red hand controlling the tiller or the blue hand controlling the tiller? If you look back through at least since the 1990s, I've written about this. Attitudes toward the party that's not in power simply are not a reliable predictor of what's going to happen in the midterm. In 2010, just before Republicans had the best midterm for either party since 1938, winning over 60 House seats, the Democratic image
halfway through Obama's first term.
Halfway through Obama's first term, the Democratic image was as good as the Republican image in Gallup polling. And in 2018, when Democrats won 40 seats in the House, the Republican image was almost as good as the Democratic image. It was virtually no different. And why? So why did these, decisive outcomes happen? They happen because people were voting primarily on their view about the president. I mean, what we're going to see, I will go out on a limb. I will guarantee you that somewhere between 86 and 91% of people who say in the exit polls that they disapprove of Trump will vote Democratic for the House, and somewhere around 90% of people who approve of Trump will vote Republican for the House. In Trump's entire first term, in all of the Senate races during his 2018 and 2020, all the Senate races while he was in the White House, Susan Collins of Maine in 2020 was the only Republican Senate incumbent or candidate who held their Democratic opponent to less than 89% of the people who disapproved of Trump. If you look back last November in Virginia and in New Jersey, Spanberger and Sherrill each won over 90% of people who disapproved of Trump. Even Jay Jones, the Virginia governor candidate who would, texting those comments about, killing his political opponents or rivals, he won 89% of people who disapproved of Trump. Okay. Susan Collins, I believe, is the only Republican senator who won in a state where Trump's approval rating was under 50%. And conversely, in 2020, people may remember, some of the people on this call may have painful memories of contributing to the Democratic Senate candidates in Kansas and South Carolina and Montana and Kentucky and Texas. And was there another one? They raised something like $750 million, those candidates running in red states. And there was great optimism. Trump won all of those states. None of them except Bullock in South Dakota, in Montana, won more than 10% of people who approved of Trump, and they all lost. Yeah. So what that tells me is that anywhere where Trump's approval is below 50% in November, Democrats have a real shot. Maybe very strong candidates like Roy Cooper in North Carolina and Sherrod Brown in Ohio could win in a state where he's at 51 or even 52 maybe for Cooper, I don't think for Brown. But any place where he's under 50, Democrats are going to be very much in the hunt, and we can talk more about that.
So there's a strategy question, and I think it was in that Texas state Senate race, don't quote me, where a very strongly Trump district went for the Democrat.
Yeah.
And usually we wouldn't pay much attention to state Senate races, but this one was particularly bellwether. And I think it was there, if I'm not wrong, where the Republican candidate stopped running ads mentioning Trump and just identified as a Republican. Is that a harbinger of what we're going to see? Are there Republicans who will be running away from Trump?
Well, no one's going to run away from him until after their primary, that's for sure. Like, they are all terrified of him coming in and endorsing their opponent. I actually think it doesn't really matter that much. I mean, it matters only at the margin how much you embrace him. I mean, you saw in Virginia and New Jersey the conundrum that Republicans were in. They were in states, both of the gubernatorial candidates, the Republican gubernatorial candidates, were in states where Trump's disapproval had gone back up. He improved significantly in both states in 24 relative to 20, but his approval rating had fallen. His disapproval rating had gone back up over 55, and yet neither would criticize or distance from him in any way because they worried that he would send out a nasty tweet and depress turnout among his base. And then they kind of bound themselves to Trump, and they got what I said, which is that Sherrill and Spanberger got an even higher percentage of people who disapprove of the incumbent president than is typical. They were both, one of them was at 93 and one was at 94. I forget which is which. So, if you're looking out, at 26, the key for Democrats really is breaking into Trump country. I said a few minutes ago that our politics are becoming more parliamentary, like a parliamentary system. And the best evidence of that is the growing, almost irreversible correlation between how places vote for president and how they vote for Congress. So when Reagan won in 1984, there were approximately 190 House members who were in districts that voted the other way for president. Almost all of them Democrats who still won seats that voted for Reagan that year. And if you look at the states that voted both times for Reagan after 84, Democrats still held a majority of all the Senate seats in the states. 38 states voted both times for Reagan, and Democrats held the majority of the Senate seats in those states. Today, we're down to what? 16 House members in districts that voted the other way for president compared to 190. If you look, there are 25 states that voted for Trump 3 times. Democrats have, take a guess, how many of their Senate seats?
No clue.
0. They're down to 0. They were at 8 in 2017. They're down to 0. If you look at the 25 states voted for Trump 3 times, Democrats have 0 of their Senate seats. Compared to a majority of the Senate seats in the states that voted twice for Reagan, and a majority of the Senate seats in the states that voted for Reagan, and Bush 3 times. Democrats are almost as dominant in the states that have voted 3 times against Trump, but there are only 19 of them. So Democrats have 37 of the 38 Senate seats in the states that voted 3 times against Trump, and they have a really good shot at Susan Collins this year, which would give them 38 out of 38. They are competitive in the Senate only because they have 10 of the 12 seats in the states that have flipped at any time under Trump. There are 6 states that have flipped at any time under Trump. You got Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin in the Rust Belt, the Pauwee, as Tad Devine calls them, because they're really one state. And then North Carolina, Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia in the Sun Belt. Democrats have 10 of those 12 seats. So if you kind of look at the Senate map, yes, Democrats can pick up the last remaining 3-time anti-Trump state seat by beating Collins. But that's not going to get them there, right? The only way to get there is to reestablish a beachhead in the states that Trump has won 3 times. Their best chances are North Carolina, in order, Ohio, and Alaska, followed probably by Texas if it's Ken Paxton, and Iowa, which is a long.
The Republican nominee is Ken Paxton.
The Republican nominee is Ken Paxton in Texas. So then they, at the same time, they have to defend a couple states that they've won 3 times, Minnesota, New Hampshire. I don't think that's going to be that hard in this environment with Trump's approval where it is. A little more difficulty, but still favored to defend 2 of their 10 seats in the states that have flipped, and that's Georgia and Michigan. But if you're sitting there at home and you want to kind of conceptualize the Senate, people kind of get lost in the map. It's actually pretty simple. 25 states have voted 3 times for Trump. Republicans have all 50 of their Senate seats. Obviously, if Democrats concede 50 seats right off the bat, you got to win everything else in the vice presidency. You don't give yourself a lot of room for error. Democrats have to break back into there. They have to win the last Republican held seat in their 19 3-time anti-Trump states, and they got to defend their preponderant advantage in the 6 states that have flipped.
Just today, the Supreme Court said that California is redistricting into creating 5 predominantly Democratic congressional districts was okay. And you think they could hardly do otherwise because
Yeah.
this was something Californians voted for themselves. It wasn't just a legislative attempt. So, given all that back and forth in Texas and California and other states, Virginia, I can't even remember where
Right.
Virginia is at this point.
Yeah.
What net effect would all that redistricting have, do you think, in the House?
Right. Well, first of all, let's just, again, compared to the 80s and 90s, and even compared to 2018, there are very few split ticket districts anymore. There are only 3 Republicans in districts that voted for Harris. And I believe the number was 24 in 2018. There were 24 Republicans in districts that voted for Clinton, and they were wiped out. Democrats won almost all of those seats. It was a real underpinning of how they got to 40, which is why Democrats, it's going to be very hard to get anywhere near that, even if Trump's approval rating is low. There are only 13 Democrats in districts that Trump won, and those are the top target for Republicans. The redistricting I think, is going to end up as a wash at best for Republicans. And talk about why. Not only did Democrats here in California in particular really respond, and Virginia, they are in the process of fighting it out in courts. Republicans have gone to court. If the state Supreme Court, which I believe has mostly Republican justices, nominated justices on it, stops them, that's one thing. If the Supreme Court doesn't stop them, they will likely be able to win as many as 4 more seats. Utah, not a partisan process, but Democrats have been able to pick up a seat. New York, I think that the courts there are going to side with them and they're going to pick up a seat. Ohio created some more seats for Republicans. North Carolina created some more seats for Republicans, and Florida certainly will create some more seats for Republicans. The big wild card is, again, the Supreme Court may further weaken the Voting Rights Act and allow in a way that allows southern states to go back and eliminate some majority minority seats now held by Democrats. On balance, I think most people feel that the redistricting war is kind of a wash at this point. Like, kind of the most interesting one to me is Texas, because the Texas redistricting is founded on the assumption that Trump's support among Latinos in 26 will be comparable to what it was in 24. And it is not. In polling, again, today, there was another poll out today with his disapproval rating at 70% among Latinos. He ran better. Every data source agrees that he ran better among Latinos than any Republican in modern times. Better than Reagan, better than Bush in 04. He probably won a majority of Latino men, right?
And yet, he's not only lost all of those gains, but even more from the looks.
He's kind of back. He's kind of back to more like the 2018 range than even the 2020 range at the moment. Now we'll see whether where that holds, where that comes out. But that's really critical because Republicans are counting on beating 2 Latino Democrats in South Texas, as well as holding Monica De La Cruz, a Republican seat in South Texas, against a former Tejano star, Bobby Polito. And even in Texas, his numbers among Latinos have significantly declined.
So let me ask about issues then, because there is a sense of national disapproval, as you reflected in the numbers, about the way Trump is managing immigration. But there are still constituencies. Latinos, of course, would be outraged by what's going on with ICE, as would many other people. But you write about the working class white voters. What is going to turn them against Trump? Is it the economy? Is ICE going to be a priority for them? It's not going to be Iran. It's not going to be the Middle East. So where are the constituents and what are the issues that will drive them?
So I think from the trends in Trump's approval rating, it is as close to guaranteed as you get that if we have a free and fair election, Democrats will run better than they did in 24 among college-educated white voters, Latino voters, Black voters, and young voters. I mean, the discontent in all of those groups, the disillusion, the sense that they are getting a lot of stuff from the Trump administration that they didn't want. And look, I think people had to twist themselves into pretzels to convince themselves this was not exactly what he was planning on immigration. Nonetheless, people did twist themselves into pretzel. Those constituencies, they're getting a lot of stuff they didn't want, and they're not getting the main thing they did want, which was an improvement in their cost of living, as anybody who's gone to the grocery store can tell you. But to me, the key to the scale of this election are those working class white voters. Now, working class white voters have been shrinking as a share of the electorate steadily since the 1960s, but they are still the biggest single group. They were 37% of all voters nationally in 2024.
And I think you said they're concentrated in states
And
where they have disproportionate power.
and if you look at the target list, if you look at the 10 states that both sides consider the most competitive for the Senate, they are, non-college whites are a significantly larger share of the electorate than they are nationally in 6 of them, slightly larger in 2 more. If you look at the 37 House seats that Democrats are targeting, the DCCC is officially targeting in November, whites without a college degree are more than their national share in 25 of the 37. So if we're talking about Maine or Ohio, defending someplace like Minnesota or New Hampshire in the Senate, Alaska, North Carolina, the House seats in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in Florida, in Iowa, the Democrats are targeting. The key between a good night for Democrats, which I think is essentially guaranteed, again, fair election, and a great night, is whether Trump's grip loosens on blue collar whites. So where are we on that? Each of his 3 elections, Pat, he has won about 2/3 of whites without a college degree. That is the best performance for any candidate in either party since Ronald Reagan in 1984. I mean, it is impressive. And if you ask me the single biggest reason Kamala Harris is not the president, it's that she could not win over a competitive number of working class, non-college white women in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, despite—
Wasn't that the case with Hillary Clinton as well?
Same thing, absolutely. And by the way, Harris was, despite the group American Bridge spending $120 million just in those 3 states, just aimed at those women. And she still lost ground among them. And that's a kind of a long-term problem about whether enough of them are willing to vote for a woman president. But nonetheless, these voters are the absolute core of Trump's coalition. 2 national polls last week, one from Pew, one from Fox, put his approval rating with non-college white voters at basically only 50-50. There were other polls in January, many other polls. Siena, New York Times, which is probably the most respected of all right now, CNN, CBS, YouGov, all put his disapproval among non-college whites in the mid to high 40s, right? So there's an agreement that his disapproval among those voters is higher than it was certainly in 2020 or 2018. Now, you could point out to me, and I'm sure you will, those voters don't think a lot of Democrats either, right? I mean, they don't, and they don't. They are deeply suspicious of Democrats. There was there are various projects going on among Democratic interest groups trying to study where they are with these voters. And the answer is always, we are at the bottom of a really deep ditch. But what I will say to you is that is likely to matter a lot more in 28 if they can't resolve it than 26, because the evidence is overwhelming that, like everyone else, if you are a working class white voter who disapproves of Trump, you are going to vote Democratic in all likelihood in the midterm election. In 2018, 89%, I believe it was 88% of non-college whites who disapproved of Trump voted Democratic for the House. In 2020, it was over 90%. Their problem was only about 35% of those non-college whites at that point disapproved of Trump. So if that disapproval number, in fact, stays in the low to mid 40s by November, and no guarantee that Trump can't recover among them, but if his disapproval among blue-collar whites remains somewhere in the 42 to 45 range, that's how Democrats go from a good night in the House to a really good night, and how they seriously put the Senate in play. Because if his disapproval is 45% nationally among non-college whites, last point I will give you, this is maybe more detail that you want to know, but it's really relevant. His overall rating among non-college whites is always elevated because so many of them in the South are also evangelical Christians. If you look at the states that really matter this year, Alaska, Ohio, Maine in particular, not as many of them are evangelical Christians. So
Mm.
whatever his overall approval rating is going to be nationally among non-college whites, it's going to be weaker in those states. And if he's at 45, 44% disapproval nationally among them, Sherrod Brown has a real chance to win.
Okay,
And
so
Mary Peltola has a real chance to
I
win.
want to go to our viewer questions and we'll
Yeah.
need to get shorter answers so we can get
Yes.
more of them in. But my last question, again, if we can get a shorter answer before we do, is Trump has been calling for nationalizing elections. To what extent will individual Republican state legislatures try to do their best to suppress the vote, to fall in line with Donald Trump, to say, sure, ICE, come on in and patrol our voting places? How much of that is already in the works, and how much of it do you think can succeed?
I think there'll be a lot of that. I mean, the Republican red states have passed an extensive agenda since 2020 to restrict access to the ballot, everything from, barring the water online in Georgia to more stringent voter ID and limit on mail. So I suspect that red states will be doing pretty much everything they can, and there will be a lot of litigation in the last 2 months before the election to try to stop some of it.
Here's a question from Michael about whether states themselves can preemptively call out their National Guards to protect polling places and ballot counting facilities so as to force out or sort of prevent or block out the any Trump ICE actions.
Uh, Totally seems within the realm of possibility to me, and totally kind of a Fort Sumter kind of moment. It's what I said before. I think, that the way Trump is governing in general, with elections is maybe the most pronounced example, is making a clash between federal and state forces almost inevitable before 2028 on some front, on some issue.
Well, when you say Fort Sumter, I just got a chill thinking of
Yeah. Well,
how
Tim
it would be
Walz used that
coming.
example. Tim Walz used that example the other day himself to our LA colleague Jacob Soboroff at MS Now.
Oh, let's see. People feel very frustrated, as you know, and Ruth wants to know, as many people do, other than contacting elected officials, and so many people who are watching this are probably in blue districts anyway. What what is a strategy that would finally get to this administration? Would it be working class, middle class white voters, even before the election, turning out to rebuke him? Would he even at some point throw Stephen Miller under the bus to say, okay, there you go, now go ahead and vote for me?
I think hard to imagine him throwing Stephen Miller under the bus. I'm not an expert in kind of popular resistance to authoritarianism, although I've talked to a lot of people who are, and I think the short answer is everything. Like, if you are alarmed by the way this government is threatening basic constitutional freedoms and our basic constitutional system, the answer is do everything. I mean, post, network with your friends, participate in demonstrations, look at ways to volunteer for the election. There is no organized consumer boycotts of companies that are propping up the administration. I mean, the answer is do everything. I mean, I really do think, people sometimes say to me, this, it feels like we are sliding into a dark pit, and we may be, but the game is still on our stick. I mean, there is no guaranteed outcome here. The future is not foretold. Trump is going further, faster, more dangerously to threaten our basic constitutional order than I think almost anybody was willing to admit in 24. But the pushback is also big and broad, and this is not decided. This is not, no one should act like this is decided. The game is on your stick as a citizen.
Mina wants to know, I'll paraphrase this. Are there any Supreme Court decisions outstanding between now and November that could affect the public attitude toward Trump or toward the midterms?
Well, as I mentioned, the voting rights case could really, if they further eviscerate the Voting Rights Act, it could open the door, depending on when they do it, to southern states further gerrymandering out Democratic minority seats now held by Democrats. By the way, this is a lot like the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution, because if you look at the states, Louisiana, Texas, Georgia, Alabama, where this might happen, all or almost all their population growth is being driven by their non-white population, by black and brown residents. And then they would use that population growth disenfranchise those voters and create districts to elect more white Republicans. It's an awful lot like the Constitution allowing you to count slaves as three-fifths of a person for the purposes of electoral college and the House, but not giving them the vote,
Exactly.
as I wrote recently.
Yes, so you could take advantage of your black population to give yourself more elected officials, none of whom would be black.
That's pretty much it.
Um, I don't see a name on this, but a question that Adam Schiff had talked about congressional Democrats putting plans in place to cover various contingencies, especially given how they were flat-footed after January 6th. Do you have any sense of what some of those plans are?
I don't have a good sense of it because, as I said, I think it has to be divided into two categories. I mean, I think there is a lot of thinking about litigation. And, Democratic attorneys general have filed over 75 cases, I believe, against Trump. I mean, those muscles are well developed. The question of physically defending polling places and ballots takes us to a place we haven't really been in a very long time. Again, almost in the reverse in the 60s with segregation of southern states using state forces to try to suppress the vote and the federal government having to use U.S. Marshals and others to defend it. But I suspect that governors are talking. I do know that governors are on text chains. Like I've talked to governors who, like for example, when Trump was threatening to arrest Newsom and Pritzker, at various points during the immigration offensives. I know the Democratic governors were kind of wargaming how they would respond. So I would presume they're doing the same here.
Um, the question of whether there is some, we call it an October surprise, but something that could happen that would be distracting, that would be diverting, that Trump could use to try to rally the nation behind him and say, okay, there's an election, but this is much bigger than what's going on in our country right now.
Yeah, look, I think he will do whatever he can like that. I think they're going to try in a kind of a preemptive way to send rebates to people, tax rebates, another reconciliation bill this
With
year.
his name on it as if
With
it
his
was
name on it and not only that, say it's a Trump tariff rebate because the tariffs are a big part of why people are so down on his economic management. It's worth noting, by the way, as we said, in his first term, his approval on the economy for handling the economy is almost always higher than his overall approval. It was a floor lifting him up. Now it is lower. It is lower than at any point during his first term. It is a headwind driving him down. So they may try to respond to that. But, I think that, Trump's problem is only secondarily all the ways in which he is threatening kind of our democratic system. That is energizing a lot of voters who are uneasy about him, and the immigration has driven away some Latinos. But the core problem he's got is when people go to the grocery store. People sometimes say, well, Trump does well with low information voters. That's true. But as I often like to say, even people who don't pay a lot of attention to politics are experts in their own lives. And they know how much money they have in their pocket at the end of the week and the end of the month. And it's not clear to me exactly what you could do that would cause someone struggling to pay for groceries to forget that they are struggling to pay for groceries.
even a one-time check rebate might not do the trick.
I don't think so. I mean, yeah, at the margin, somebody, but you're talking about a presidential approval rating at the moment, fundamentally rooted in discontent over the economy that is at the high that points toward substantial losses for his party. Now, for all the reasons we talked about, the losses probably can't get as big as they were in 2010 or even 2018, but they can get plenty big to lose the House and potentially even to lose the Senate.
Well, and here's Victor's question. Trump told Republicans last month that if Democrats win control of the House, that he will be impeached. He's already been impeached twice, not removed from office.
Yeah.
Is that what's driving him, or is it just this sense that if I lost, something was unfair? Because we see it now, 2020, 6 years ago, he's still pushing that election was unfair. I was cheated in Georgia button.
I think after being impeached twice, I don't think he's as fearful of that as some people think. I mean, he knows that the Senate, is never going to have 67 votes. And look, Mitch McConnell had his moment in 2021 where he could have kind of said that this is beyond the pale, and instead he discouraged Republicans for voting for conviction and said the criminal justice system could take care of it, and then John Roberts took care of that. So I don't know. I think he just does not want the pressure of a Democratic House, much less a Democratic Senate. By the way, if Democrats win the Senate in November, what are the chances that Alito or Thomas resign in November? They try to rush through a replacement.
Well, it's happened before, hasn't it?
Mhm. Well,
Where is
yeah.
the big donor money going to come from this election cycle? Are some people backing away from Trump?
No,
Is he tainted
no,
goods?
no, they're raising enormous amounts of money. I mean, what we've seen is, for my 2 cents, the single most revealing piece written in the entire Trump presidency was by, I think his name is David Pressman. He was Biden's ambassador to Hungary. He wrote a piece in the New York Times late July saying, "I am watching here what I saw in Hungary. All the elites, so many of the elites of society, instead of standing together against the erosion of democracy, all thought they were smart enough to make their own deal with the dictator." And I think we are seeing the same thing, and that translates into an awful lot of money in Republican hands right now for the election.
And that happened in Germany in the 1932.
Yeah,
In the
yeah.
30s too, they thought they could handle him. That well,
They
we've
brought
got
him
him
in,
in
von
hand
Papen brought him into the government.
and got them under control.
Yeah.
Let's see. Well, this is the question from Stuart about other than excessive use of force by ICE. Do non-college whites really care about Trump's overreach in democracy? Does it seem too
No.
abstract? You see the interviews that are cherry-picked, of course, with Trump supporters saying, I don't care if he's a dictator, I don't care if he's this. It's sort of making the trains run on time, even though the trains are not running on time.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, for those voters, those blue collar, look, if you're struggling to make ends meet, democracy feels a little abstract, and that's just the reality. Trump's problem there is he hasn't delivered the improvement in the cost of living that people expected. And in fact, many of them think his policies have made things worse. I mean, I pointed out in that story that I think it was the New York Times Siena poll, more non-college whites say his policies have hurt than helped the economy, and in a separate poll, more non-college whites said his policies have increased rather than lowered costs. That's the core of his problem. And all this other stuff does figure in, but a little indirectly. I'll say real quickly, the fact that he's tearing down the East Wing and invading Venezuela and seizing ballots and busting heads in Minneapolis, his core voters or the people at the periphery of his coalition may have whatever they think about that one way or the other. But what they do believe is that it's more evidence that he is focusing on his own personal, kind of obsessions rather than their problems. So it's not, I mean, it may not be that they are not as animated by it as college white women who, really are motivated by this threat. But it does further their sense that Trump is not focusing on what they wanted him to focus on, and certainly not delivering what they wanted him to deliver.
In his second inauguration speech, I think he said that I am your revenge,
Yeah.
or in speeches beforehand. And I think a lot of people are thinking, well, what are we avenging here? All we see is that he's cut this deal now with this country and that country. And so does the corruption aspect of this, that he has enriched himself by billions in less than a year, in office, does that touch anybody except the people who would ordinarily be
No,
outraged?
Democrats are very confident that works as part of what I just said, right? Trump ran that he was going to solve your problems. And instead, in office, he's done everything but. He's enriched himself and his buddies. He's cut taxes for his rich friends. He's engaged in all these vendettas against people he thinks are enemies. He's launched all these foreign adventures. And meanwhile, you still can't afford your groceries. And if anything, he's made your life worse with his tariffs and his cuts in Medicaid and the ACA. So corruption very much fits into the distraction, self-dealing argument that I think is going to be formidable.
So they see him as picking irrelevant fights rather than solving anything that's already on their plates.
Yeah, they see him as focusing on his own obsessions and including, I mean, Trump got a $500 million investment from Abu Dhabi and all I got was this T-shirt kind of argument, I mean, that's kind of, I think, the way Democrats want, like the core argument, as I said, he was going to solve your problems. Has he solved your problems? No. But he's done a lot of other things. He's made himself richer. He's given tax cuts to his buddies. He has, all of these ways in which he's doing anything but the main marquee core thing he promised you he would do.
Judge Joe has a question about Susan Collins, and I think it was just today or yesterday that Brian Kilmeade on Fox said that the reason that ICE is pulling back in Maine is to help Susan Collins in her reelection campaign.
Yeah.
And his question is about what you anticipate for Susan Collins, who has always been a bellwether and a subject of much criticism and hope by Democrats at the same time.
Well, as I said, in Trump's entire first term, she is the only Republican senator who held their Democratic opponent to less than 89% of voters who disapproved of Trump. I think only 73% of voters who disapproved of Trump voted against her. The key were older women, and they're all older white women because they're all white women in Maine. There were I haven't written this yet, but if you go back and you comb through the data, there were a lot of older white women who voted for Biden and voted for Collins. Now, Collins is going to make the argument that Maine is better off with me there, and I can try to intercede on our behalf against Trump rather than someone like the governor who is going to be at war with him. The governor is going to make the parliamentary argument. The first vote Susan Collins casts is to make John Thune the majority leader and thus to protect Trump in every possible way for the next 6 years. I think that is going to be harder for Collins to overcome than in the past, but not insurmountable. And I think that if the Democrats nominate the younger oyster farmer, Graham Plattner, that in Maine, at least, is solving a problem that doesn't exist. I mean, he's someone who, yes, could excite a lot of young voters. There aren't that many young voters in Maine. It's like one of the oldest states in the country. 2/3 of the electorate in Maine is over 50. The core constituency that will decide Maine are older white women, most of them without college degrees. And I think the 77-year-old governor who has stood up to Trump is probably a better fit for them than the young oyster guy who has, Nazi tattoos. It's so. I mean, he does seem to be a very talented guy. It's just not necessarily the best state for his talents.
Before we get to the wrap up, I want to ask you about what happened at the Washington Post today. The layoff of about a third of the staff, the closing of all the bureaus covering the Mideast, the closing of the bureau covering Ukraine, and of course, life and treasure for
Yeah.
other countries doesn't matter as much as it does for our country. But the woman who covers Amazon for the Washington Post got laid off. This is a man who set himself up as the great warrior rescuing the Washington Post, and who is now paid tens of millions of dollars for a Melania documentary that doesn't seem to recoup any money for him, and is taking it out in a way on journalism that Trump has been very critical of.
Well, I would go further. I mean, I think this is another example of what the former ambassador to Hungary is writing about. If you kind of look at the sequence of events, Bezos lurched the editorial page of the Washington Post to the right, spiking the endorsement of Kamala Harris and then replacing it with a much more conservative editorial page. I think the best numbers are 300,000 to 400,000 people then quit, discontinued their subscriptions. And then he uses that as the justification for doing something else Trump wants, which is eviscerating the paper. I think that this is the ultimate catch and kill. Like, I feel like Bezos is basically offering the Post as a human sacrifice to Trump, along with his $75 million documentary from Melania. I mean, he has clearly decided, like the head, like Tim Cook and like Zuckerberg and like so many other leaders of our most powerful institutions, that they are better off making a deal with Trump than standing up to him. And I think this is not even fundamentally a business decision, because the losses are a rounding error. This is, I think, a further way to ingratiate himself with Trump, to disable and almost destroy an institution that Trump loathes.
And you would think that if he were to stand up to Trump, he could recoup some of those losses and then some. So it might be a sound business decision, even so.
Look, I think the same, we're going to see the same trajectory at CBS. I mean, they're trying to make it more Trump friendly. The problem is that the Trump friendly audience really just overwhelmingly wants to watch conservative media. They want to watch Fox and the people who it's right. Like, you drive away your existing audience, which is either left leaning or centrist, and there's nothing there to replace them, because it's a fool's errand to think you're going to pull away real Trump acolytes from Fox to watch Tony, whatever his name is, on CBS, if he says more nice things about Marco Rubio. And so I think, if there was a business strategy at the Post, it was misguided. But I think the fundamental dynamic was they lurched it to the right, they lost their audience, and then they used that as justification to basically disembowel the paper.
Well, we always try to end on a positive note. So in our last minute or so, if you could give us something hopeful, something we can look forward to, something that people feel that is actionable on their part.
Yeah, I say, in the hockey analogy, the game is on your stick. It is not guaranteed how
That's
this
not
stick.
hockey stick economics. That's a different
No,
thing.
hockey stick. I mean, you have the ball is in your hands. I mean, you're Tom Brady in the fourth quarter here. You have the chance to affect how this turns out. And I go back. I do cite this a lot. The scene in the Fellowship of the Ring and also in the book where Frodo says to Gandalf, I wish none of this had happened. I wish the ring had never come to me. And Gandalf says, so do all who live in such times, but it is not up to us to question the times we are given. We can only choose what we do with the time we are given. And I think that is so true for everyone in America today. And everyone really needs to stand up and be counted in every way to express what you believe this country should look like and what its values should be.
Ron, if only we could fit all that on a bumper sticker.
Yeah.
We'd need even something bigger than a Cybertruck. So
Pat, there were Gandalf 1968 bumper stickers. We could do Gandalf 2020.
that kind of sums it up. Ron Brownstein, of course, the senior political analyst for CNN and a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, my old colleague. Thank you so much for joining us, for your insights, and I know we'll have you back again. There's still a long time before
Yeah.
the elections in 2026, and we need to hear from you as often as we can. Thank you again so much.
Great to be with you, and thanks everybody for watching.
And thank you all for watching and for supporting these vital programs. You can see up on the screen, we have Carol Lenig next week, Susan Glasser the week after that, Max Boot, and then Ken Burns in March. I'll be speaking with him and with Rick Atkinson. I know you'll enjoy all of these programs, and get your questions ready because you'll have plenty to talk about. Thank you again for joining us and for supporting the work here at JUDJ.